My name is Barbara, and I am 63 years old. As a retired public school teacher, I dedicated 37 years of my life to nurturing young minds, creating safe, supportive environments where children could flourish. After my retirement, I selflessly supported my daughter Melody through her difficult divorce, providing constant emotional support and frequent loving childcare for my 2 young grandchildren, Ethan and Chloe. I ensured their stability during those tumultuous months, my life devoted entirely to their well-being and happiness. Then my world shattered in the most unthinkable way. Melody, my own daughter, filed a shocking legal motion, falsely accusing me of child physical and emotional abuse toward my beloved grandchildren. She presented fabricated evidence to the court, a photo of a bruise on Ethan's arm, deliberately cropped to hide the fact that he had fallen at school playground. The judge immediately banned me from all contact with my grandchildren. "You're a danger to my children," Melody testified with cold calculation. "You have no humanity left for innocent kids." My grandson Ethan, coached by his mother, screamed at me during our last supervised visit. "You're crazy, Grandma. You hurt me. My life's work, my integrity, my very humanity, all viciously attacked. I was branded a child abuser, utterly discarded, profoundly alone, my reputation in shambles, as I plunged into the deepest despair I had ever known. Yet as the darkness threatened to consume me entirely, something stirred within my teacher's heart. That unwavering drive for truth that had guided me through decades of working with children ignited a cold, righteous fury. What Melody, her best friend Brenda, and their lawyer Mr. Davies didn't know was my secret weapon. For years, I had kept meticulous daily journals recording every interaction with my grandchildren, every minor injury, including Ethan's playground fall, every moment of joy and care. I had hundreds of candid family videos showing the love and laughter we shared. Most importantly, my discreet doorbell camera had captured Melody leaving my home in an agitated state immediately before she filed her false accusations. My former principal, our family doctor, and a retired judge who knew my character all waited in the wings, ready to testify to the truth. This time, Melody's insidious slander wouldn't just unravel. It would expose her shocking cruelty, help me reclaim my grandchildren, and restore my dignity. Sometimes the truth takes time to surface, but when it does, it shines bright enough to illuminate even the darkest lies. The morning after receiving the temporary restraining order, I drove to Melody's house with trembling hands, my heart pounding with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. Surely there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Surely my daughter, the little girl I had raised with such love and devotion, couldn't have deliberately fabricated such horrific accusations against me. I knocked on the door that I had painted myself just 2 years earlier when I helped Melody settle into her new home after the divorce. The door opened, but only a crack secured by the chain lock. "Melody, sweetheart," I began, my voice shaking. "Please, we need to talk. There's been some terrible mistake. You know I would never hurt Ethan or Chloe. You know how much I love them." My daughter's face appeared in the narrow opening, but it wasn't the face of the child I remembered. Her expression was hard cold, filled with what looked like righteous indignation, but felt like practiced cruelty. "There's no mistake, Mother," she said, using a tone I had never heard from her before. "I know what you did to Ethan. I have proof. The court has proof." Before I could respond, a man in an expensive suit appeared behind her. Mr. Davies, the lawyer she had hired for her divorce proceedings, now apparently representing her in this nightmare case against me. "Mrs. Peterson," he said with cold professionalism, "you're in violation of the restraining order by being here. I suggest you leave immediately before we're forced to call the police." He handed me a thick envelope through the crack in the door. "These are the formal court documents. Your daughter is prepared to testify about the physical and emotional abuse you inflicted on her children. The evidence is overwhelming." I stared at the envelope, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. "Melody, please look at me. You're my daughter. You know who I am. I'm a teacher. I've spent my entire life protecting children, not hurting them." For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, a shadow of doubt perhaps, or a glimmer of the love we had once shared. But it vanished so quickly I might have imagined it. "I know exactly who you are," she said, her voice steady and rehearsed. "You're a danger to my children. You physically hurt Ethan, and God knows what else you've done that I haven't discovered yet. You're a cruel, abusive woman hiding behind a sweet facade, and you have no humanity left for innocent children." The words hit me like physical blows. Each accusation was more devastating than the last, not just because they were false, but because they came from the mouth of my own child. "You're losing your mind, Mother." Melody continued her performance, flawless in its calculated cruelty. "I saw the bruise on Ethan's arm. I know what you did to him. You're a monster, and I won't let you hurt my babies anymore." What I discovered later was that Melody's motivation went far beyond simple malice. Her divorce settlement included substantial child support and alimony payments totaling over $5,000 per month, but only as long as she maintained primary custody of the children. If David, her ex-husband, gained any significant custody rights, her financial support would be drastically reduced. By painting me as an abusive figure who had been helping David during their custody battles, she could eliminate both threats at once. She would maintain sole custody, keep her financial benefits, and remove the grandmother who had been advocating for her son-in-law's right to see his children. I tried desperately to explain pulling out my daily journals from my purse. "Melody, look at these. I document everything. Ethan fell at school that day. You even called me from the school nurse's office. The bruise happened on the playground and you know it." But the door was already closing. "Those journals prove nothing except your obsession with control, Mr. Davies called through the narrowing gap. "We'll see you in court, Mrs. Peterson. I suggest you hire a good lawyer." As I stood on the porch, where I had once been welcomed with hugs and kisses from my grandchildren, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The home I had helped create, the family I had supported through crisis, the children I had loved unconditionally, all of it was being turned against me. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. Within hours of my visit, Brenda, Melody's best friend and constant companion, had taken to social media with a vengeance. "Warning to all parents in our community," she posted on Facebook. "Barbara Peterson, the retired teacher from Lincoln Elementary, is a child abuser. Her own daughter has proof that she physically hurt her grandson. This woman has been trusted with our children for decades. How many others has she hurt? Protect your kids. She's utterly depraved and dangerous." And the post was shared dozens of times within hours. My phone began ringing with calls from former colleagues, neighbors, and parents of children I had taught. Some called to express disbelief, but others called to withdraw invitations, cancel social plans, and distance themselves from the scandal. The most heartbreaking call came from my former principal, Margaret Wilson, who had become a close friend over the years. "Barbara," she said, her voice filled with confusion and pain, "I've been getting calls all day. Parents are asking if their children were ever alone with you. The school board is talking about removing your photo from the Hall of Honor. I don't know what to believe anymore." That evening, the situation became even more surreal when David, Melody's ex-husband, called me. He was the one person who should have been my ally, the one who knew how much I loved his children and how much they loved me, Barbara. He said, "I tried to speak up for you in court today, but the judge dismissed my testimony as biased. He said I was just trying to undermine Melody's credibility for my own custody case." I could hear the frustration and sadness in his voice. David had always appreciated my relationship with his children, had often told me how grateful he was that they had such a loving grandmother in their lives. "I know this is all lies," he continued, "but my lawyer says getting involved could hurt my own case. I'm sorry, Barbara. I'm so sorry. I can't help you." The next day brought even more devastating news. Mr. Davies had filed additional motions demanding access to my personal journal's photo albums and any financial records related to child care expenses. He was painting a picture of a grandmother who had been documenting the children's lives for nefarious purposes, who had been financially exploiting the family's crisis. The court also ordered me to undergo a psychological evaluation with a court-appointed psychiatrist. When I expressed concern about the fairness of this process, the judge noted my defensive behavior and resistance to accountability in the official record. The trap was closing around me with devastating efficiency. Every protest I made was used as evidence of my instability. Every attempt to defend myself was twisted into proof of my guilt. Every expression of love for my grandchildren was characterized as obsessive and potentially dangerous. As I sat in my empty house that night, surrounded by photos of Ethan and Chloe that I was no longer allowed to see, I realized that I was fighting more than just false accusations. I was fighting a carefully constructed narrative designed to destroy not just my relationship with my grandchildren, but my entire identity as someone who had devoted her life to loving and protecting children. The woman who had spent 37 years in classrooms, who had been trusted by thousands of parents, who had been honored by her school district for her dedication to child welfare, was now being portrayed as a predator. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and humiliation, my teacher's instincts were awakening. I had spent decades learning to recognize the difference between truth and deception, between genuine distress and manufactured drama. And something about Melody's performance, something about the timing and precision of these accusations felt wrong. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a detective, and I was about to begin the most important investigation of my life. The nightmare escalated beyond anything I could have imagined when Melody filed for an expedited criminal investigation against me. The local police received her complaint, alleging that the bruise on Ethan's arm constituted evidence of child abuse requiring immediate criminal accountability. "Mrs. Peterson," Detective Martinez said when he arrived at my door, "we need to discuss some serious allegations that have been made against you." Sitting in my living room, the same room where Ethan and Chloe had played countless games and shared so many hugs, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. A police detective was questioning me about hurting the children I loved more than my own life. "I understand you're a retired teacher," he said, consulting his notes. "You should know that mandated reporters take these kinds of allegations very seriously." I tried to explain about Ethan's fall at school, about my daily journals that documented every interaction, about the dozens of witnesses who could vouch for my character. But I could see in his eyes that he had already been influenced by the narrative Melody and her team had constructed. "Ma'am, I have to tell you the photo evidence is pretty compelling," he said. "That's a significant bruise on a small child's arm." What he didn't mention, what I learned later, was that Brenda had already leaked the photo to Channel 7 News. The image of Ethan's bruise, deliberately cropped to remove any context, was broadcast that evening, with the caption, "Local grandmother accused of child abuse." I watched the news report in stunned horror, seeing my name and my photograph displayed alongside that damning image. The reporter spoke about the trusted educator who had betrayed the community's faith and the brave mother who had spoken up to protect her children. They interviewed Brenda on camera, her face a perfect mask of concerned citizenship. "I've known Barbara for years," she said with practiced sorrow. "I always thought she was a wonderful grandmother, but looking back now, there were signs. The way she insisted on documenting everything the children did, the way she seemed to need constant contact with them. I think we all missed the warning signs." Sitting in my chair watching my reputation be destroyed on television, I remembered every detail of that day. Ethan had been so excited to show me the new monkey bars at his school playground. I had picked him up early for our planned afternoon at the park, and he had begged me to come see what he could do. "Watch this, Grandma," he had called out, swinging from bar to bar with the fearless enthusiasm of a 7-year-old. When he fell, I was the one who rushed to comfort him. I was the one who checked his arm for breaks, who cleaned his scraped knee, who held him while he cried. Melody hadn't even been there. She was at work trusting me to care for her son. I had called her immediately from the school nurse's office. "Ethan took a little tumble on the playground," I had said. "He's fine, just a bruise on his arm and a scraped knee." The nurse checked him over. Melody's response had been completely normal. "Oh no, my poor baby. Give him extra hugs from Mommy. Thanks for taking such good care of him, Mom." Now that same fall, that same bruise she had known was from the playground was being used to paint me as a child abuser. But the true horror of Melody's betrayal became clear during a phone conversation I overheard by accident. I had gone to her house one more time, hoping to catch her in a moment of clarity to remind her of who I really was. When no one answered the door, I walked around to the back garden where I could hear voices. Melody was on the phone, and her tone was nothing like the grieving, protective mother she portrayed in public. "No, I know she didn't actually hurt him," I heard her say through the open window. "But that doesn't matter. The bruise exists, the timing works, and my lawyer says that's all we need. Once she's completely out of the picture, David won't have any allies in his custody fight." My blood turned to ice. She knew. She knew the accusations were false, and she was using them anyway. "The beauty of it is that she can't prove a negative," Melody continued with chilling calculation. "How do you prove you didn't hurt someone, especially when there's a bruise and I'm willing to testify that she did it?" The conversation continued, revealing the depth of the conspiracy against me. Melody and her lawyer had identified me as the biggest threat to her custody arrangement because I had been advocating for David's rights as a father and because the children loved me so much. "She's always been too involved anyway," Melody said with casual cruelty. "Always documenting everything, always having opinions about parenting decisions. This way, I get rid of the interference and secure my position as the only stable guardian." Standing in that garden, listening to my daughter discuss my destruction like a business transaction, I felt something inside me break. This wasn't desperation or confusion or even misguided protectiveness. This was calculated malice from someone who was supposed to love me. That night alone in my house, I found myself remembering something I had tried to forget for over 20 years. A secret I had kept to protect Melody, a sacrifice I had made that now seemed like a cruel irony. When Melody was 8 years old, there had been a terrible accident at our home. She had been playing with matches in the garage, something I had explicitly forbidden, when she accidentally started a small fire. The damage was minimal, but a neighbor's dog had been killed in the smoke, and the incident had become neighborhood news. The fire inspector determined that the cause was undetermined, But I knew the truth. Melody had confessed to me in tears, terrified that she would be blamed for the dog's death, that everyone would hate her. As a teacher, I understood child psychology. I could see that Melody was already traumatized by what had happened, already carrying guilt that was too heavy for an 8-year-old to bear. So I made a decision that would shape the rest of our relationship. I took the blame. I told the investigators that I must have left a cigarette burning in the garage, even though I didn't smoke. I paid for the neighbor's dog and for the property damage. Most importantly, I helped Melody forget her role in the incident, gradually helping her reshape the memory until she genuinely believed it was my fault. I thought I was protecting her from trauma and guilt. I thought I was being a good mother by taking on her burden. What I didn't realize was that I was teaching her that truth was negotiable, that reality could be reshaped to serve emotional needs, that loving someone sometimes meant accepting blame for things you didn't do. For 20 years, Melody had believed that I was responsible for that fire, for that dog's death. She had grown up thinking of me as someone who made serious mistakes, but who loved her enough to face the consequences. In her mind, I was someone who could be careless, irresponsible, even dangerous, but who ultimately took responsibility for the damage I caused. Now she was using that same dynamic against me, expecting me to take responsibility for abuse I hadn't committed, to accept the consequences of actions I hadn't taken, to sacrifice myself for her benefit, just as I had done when she was 8. The cosmic irony was overwhelming. My greatest act of maternal love, my willingness to protect my daughter from trauma and guilt, had become the foundation for her current betrayal. I had taught her that I would absorb blame to protect her, and now she was using that lesson to destroy me. When I tried to address this pattern during our last supervised phone call, Melody's response was swift and brutal. "Mom, you're always trying to make me feel guilty with your talk about sacrifices," she snapped. "Your past choices are your own business. Brenda thinks you're trying to manipulate me with guilt and sentimentality." Even David, my former ally, seemed to be wavering under the pressure. "Barbara, maybe you should consider the possibility that you're misremembering some things," he said during a tense phone call. Melody seems so certain, and the evidence looks compelling. "Maybe there's something you're not seeing clearly." The doubt in his voice was like a knife to my heart. If David, who knew me best, was beginning to question my version of events, how could I expect strangers to believe me? Mr. Davies presented his solution with the cold efficiency of a businessman closing a deal. If I would publicly confess to negligent grandparenting and permanently relinquish all grandparent rights, Melody would graciously agree not to press criminal charges. I would be allowed to send supervised, pre-approved letters to Ethan and Chloe twice a year. "This is really quite generous," he explained during our court-mandated mediation session. "Your daughter is willing to show mercy despite the severity of your actions. Most families wouldn't be so forgiving. The trap was perfect. Admit guilt and lose my grandchildren forever, or maintain my innocence and face criminal prosecution that could result in jail time and complete social ostracism." Sitting in that sterile conference room, listening to a lawyer discuss the terms of my surrender, I realized that I was facing more than just false accusations. I was confronting the consequences of a lifetime of putting others' needs before truth, of prioritizing peace over honesty, of teaching my own daughter that reality was something that could be manipulated for emotional comfort. But I was also a teacher who had spent decades learning to recognize the difference between justice and expedience. And something deep inside me, something that had been dormant during months of doubt and despair, was beginning to awaken. I would not confess to crimes I didn't commit. I would not abandon the grandchildren I loved. And I would not let my daughter's manipulation destroy the truth that had shaped my entire career. The woman who had once protected her daughter by accepting false blame was about to become the grandmother who would fight for truth no matter the cost. The final blow came not with drama or confrontation, but with the cold brutality of legal paperwork. I was sitting in my kitchen trying to force down a cup of coffee that tasted like ash when the certified letter arrived. Mr. Davies had crafted the document with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of an executioner. The court had accepted their motion for a permanent restraining order based on child endangerment and continued emotional harassment. I was now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my grandchildren, their home, their school, or any location where they might be present. The letter made it clear that any attempt to contact Ethan or Chloe directly or indirectly would result in immediate arrest for violating a court order. I had become a criminal in the eyes of the law, a danger to the children I had loved and protected for their entire lives. The court finds that the defendant's persistent attempts to justify her actions and blame others demonstrates a lack of insight into her behavior and poses an ongoing risk to the minor children. The order read, every phone call I had made trying to explain the truth, every letter I had written, detailing my love for my grandchildren, every desperate attempt to maintain our relationship had been twisted into evidence of my supposed mental instability and potential dangerousness. I was now legally categorized alongside convicted predators and violent criminals forbidden from being near my own grandchildren. But I couldn't give up without one final attempt to reach them. With trembling hands, I began to create something that felt like both a love letter and a eulogy for our relationship. I gathered every precious photograph I had of Ethan and Chloe, carefully selecting images that captured our happiest moments together. Ethan's first bike ride with me, running alongside him in the background. Chloe's 5th birthday party, where she had insisted I sit right next to her to help blow out the candles. Christmas mornings, summer picnics, bedtime stories, scraped knees, kissed better. A lifetime of love, documented in dozens of photographs. I arranged them carefully in a small photo album, writing brief notes beside each image to remind them of the context, the laughter, the joy we had shared. On the final page, I wrote a letter in my careful teacher's handwriting. My dearest Ethan and Chloe, I want you to know that every moment we spent together was a gift to my heart. When you're older, if you ever wonder whether your grandmother loved you, look at these photos and remember. Remember the laughter, remember the stories, remember that you were the light of my life. I will love you always, no matter what happens. Grandma Barbara. I drove to Melody's house under cover of darkness, my heart pounding with fear of being arrested for violating the restraining order. I left the album by the front door, with a note asking only that Melody give it to the children when they were older, when they could make their own decisions about our relationship. For 3 days, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps this small gesture might soften Melody's heart, might remind her of the love that had once bound our family together. Then I saw Brenda's social media post. The photos showed my carefully crafted album torn into pieces, the photographs I had treasured, scattered across what looked like a garbage can. The images of Ethan and Chloe's faces were deliberately torn through, destroying not just the pictures, but the memories themselves. Cleaning out the clutter, Brenda had written with savage satisfaction. Some people just can't let go of the past, moving forward from negativity and desperate attempts to manipulate. Time to take out the trash. The comments below were even more devastating. friends and acquaintances I had known for years, parents of children I had taught, fellow teachers I had worked alongside for decades, all expressing their support for this act of destruction. "Good for Melody for protecting her kids from that toxic woman," wrote Susan Thompson, whose daughter had been in my 3rd grade class. "I can't believe we trusted our children with her all those years," added Mike Rodriguez, a father I had worked with on countless school fundraisers. In that moment, staring at the destroyed photographs of my grandchildren's childhood, I felt something inside me die. This wasn't just about custody or legal proceedings anymore. This was about the complete erasure of my existence from their lives, the deliberate destruction of evidence that we had ever loved each other. My phone buzzed with a text message from Melody. "Consider this closed, Mom. Don't contact us again, ever. You're causing too much trouble with your delusional accusations. Move on." The casual cruelty of those words, the dismissive tone, the complete absence of any acknowledgement of our shared history. It was like being erased from existence by someone who had once called me Mommy. But the cruelest blow came the next day when I encountered Ethan at the grocery store. I was careful to maintain the legal distance required by the restraining order, but I couldn't help but look at my grandson, couldn't help but hope that maybe seeing me in person, he might remember the love we had shared. Instead, he looked directly at me and laughed, not the innocent laughter of a child, but something harder, more calculated. "Hey, isn't that the crazy lady who used to pretend to be our grandma?" he said loudly to his friend, making sure I could hear. "Mom says she's totally nuts. Why don't you just die already, lady?" The words hit me like physical blows. This was my grandson, the boy who had once run to me with skinned knees and hurt feelings, the child who had told me I gave the best hugs in the world. Now he was looking at me like I was a stranger, a crazy woman to be mocked and dismissed. That night, sitting in my therapist's office, I finally revealed the secret I had carried for over 20 years. Dr. Sarah Williams had been seeing me through this crisis, and she was one of the few people who still believed in my innocence. "There's something I never told you about Melody's childhood." I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something that might explain why she's capable of this level of deception." I told her about the fire, about 8-year-old Melody's confession, about my decision to take the blame and help her forget her role in the tragedy. "I thought I was protecting her," I said through my tears. "I thought I was being a good mother by helping her avoid the trauma and guilt. But I realize now that I was teaching her that truth was optional, that reality could be reshaped to serve emotional needs." Dr. Williams listened with the careful attention of someone who understood the complexity of family dynamics, the unintended consequences of even the most well-meaning choices. "You were trying to protect a traumatized child," she said gently, "but inadvertently, you may have taught her that loved ones are supposed to absorb blame and consequences to protect her from discomfort." The irony was devastating. In trying to shield Melody from the consequences of her childhood mistake, I had created an adult who believed that I existed to protect her from consequences, even when it meant destroying my own life. "She's using the same pattern now," Dr. Williams observed. "She's expecting you to absorb the blame for something you didn't do, to sacrifice yourself, for her benefit, just as you did when she was 8. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of clarity pierce through the fog of grief and confusion. This wasn't just about false accusations or custody battles. This was about a fundamental distortion in our relationship, one that I had unknowingly created through my own desire to protect my daughter from pain. But understanding the pattern didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it made the betrayal more profound. I had sacrificed my integrity once to protect Melody from guilt and trauma, and now she was using that same dynamic to destroy me. The woman who had spent her career teaching children to value truth and take responsibility for their actions had inadvertently raised a daughter who believed that truth was negotiable and responsibility could be transferred to someone who loved you enough to accept it. As I sat in my empty house that night, legally forbidden from seeing my grandchildren publicly branded as a child abuser, professionally destroyed by false accusations, I realized that I was facing the consequences not just of Melody's current cruelty, but of my own misguided attempts at protection decades earlier. But I was also beginning to understand something else. The meticulous documentation I had done, the videos I had taken, the daily journals I had kept. They weren't the obsessive behavior of a controlling grandmother. They were the careful records of a teacher who understood that truth needed to be preserved, that love needed to be documented, that someday someone might need evidence of what really happened. My teacher's instincts had been preparing for this battle long before I knew it was coming. The woman who had once sacrificed truth to protect her daughter was about to become the grandmother who would risk everything to reclaim it. The evidence was there. The truth was waiting, and I was finally ready to fight for both. The weeks following the destruction of my photo album marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a psychological prison. I found myself completely alone with a secret so heavy it threatened to crush what remained of my sanity. The knowledge of Melody's childhood trauma, the fire she had started, and the blame I had taken to protect her now felt like a monstrous weight pressing down on my chest every waking moment. Sitting in my empty house, legally forbidden from seeing my grandchildren, I began to question everything. Had I really helped Melody forget her role in that fire, or had I imagined it? Had my attempts to protect her actually been manipulation? Was I the toxic influence they claimed I was? The isolation was suffocating. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it might be someone offering support, but increasingly the calls were cancellations. Bridge club meetings, book club gatherings, volunteer commitments. One by one, my social connections were severed as people distanced themselves from the scandal. The professional destruction was swift and devastating. Mr. Davies had been busy behind the scenes, reaching out to educational networks and teacher associations with carefully worded concerns about my mental state and inappropriate emotional attachments to children. Dr. Patricia Thornfield, president of the State Teachers Retirement Association, called me with news that shattered what little remained of my professional identity. "Barbara," she said with uncomfortable formality, "we've received some concerning reports about your recent behavior. The board feels it would be best if you stepped back from any public educational events for the foreseeable future." The call was professional, polite, and devastating. Educational conferences I had been scheduled to speak at suddenly found other presenters. The mentorship program for new teachers that I had helped establish quietly removed my name from their materials. "There are questions about your emotional stability and your interactions with young people," Dr. Thornfield explained when I pressed for specifics. "Given the legal proceedings and the concerns raised by your own family, we feel it's prudent to maintain some distance." The message was clear. The educational community that had been my home for 4 decades no longer trusted me around children. The woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing young minds was now viewed as a potential threat to their well-being. The financial devastation followed quickly. Legal fees were mounting at an alarming rate, and my modest teacher's pension wasn't enough to cover both living expenses and the cost of defending myself against criminal charges. When my savings account was frozen, pending the outcome of David's lawsuit, I found myself facing a reality I had never imagined possible. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who avoided making eye contact as he handed me the papers. I had 30 days to vacate the home I had lived in for 23 years, the place where I had raised Melody, where my grandchildren had taken their first steps and spoken their first words. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the deputy said quietly. "I know this must be difficult." The public auction of my belongings was scheduled for the following month. Everything I had accumulated over a lifetime of teaching. My books, my furniture, my carefully preserved mementos from decades of grateful students. All of it would be sold to the highest bidder to pay legal fees and court costs. Moving into the Harbor Lights Emergency Shelter was perhaps the most humiliating experience of my life. The facility was clean and well managed, but it was impossible to ignore what it represented. I had gone from being a respected educator with a comfortable home to being a homeless woman sleeping on a cot in a room shared with 6 strangers. "First time?" asked Marie, a woman about my age who occupied the cot next to mine. "It gets easier, but it never stops feeling like a nightmare." But the cruelest blow was yet to come. 3 months after my move to the shelter, I learned that Melody and David had arranged for Ethan and Chloe to participate in a public event for the Children's Advocacy Foundation, a local charity focused on protective parenting. I watched the live stream on a computer at the public library, my heart breaking with every word my grandchildren spoke. Ethan, now 10 years old, stood at a podium with the poise of a child who had been carefully coached. Sometimes brave parents have to make hard decisions to protect their children from difficult people, he said, his young voice carrying a gravity that children shouldn't possess. "My mom is a hero because she put our safety first, even when it was really, really hard." The audience applauded, and I could see Melody in the background, beaming with pride at her son's performance. What they couldn't see, what only I could recognize, was the slight tremor in Ethan's voice, the way his eyes searched the audience for approval, the careful way he delivered each practiced line. Chloe's contribution was even more devastating. My 8-year-old granddaughter had created a drawing titled "My Happy Family," which she proudly displayed for the cameras. The crayon figures showed Melody, David, Ethan, and herself holding hands under a bright yellow sun. There was no grandmother figure anywhere in the picture. "This is my family," Chloe explained, with the innocence that only children possess. "We take care of each other and keep each other safe from people who might hurt us." The moderator asked her about difficult times in the family, and Chloe's response was clearly rehearsed, but delivered with heartbreaking sincerity. "Sometimes people we used to know try to come back and cause problems," she said, "but we learned that it's okay to say no to people who aren't good for us, even if we used to love them." Sitting in that library, watching my grandchildren publicly declare that I was someone dangerous they needed protection from, I felt something inside me shatter completely. These were the children I had rocked to sleep, who had run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, who had told me countless times that I was the best grandmother in the world. Now they were performing my erasure from their lives like actors in a play, and they seemed to genuinely believe every word they were saying. The live stream ended with thunderous applause and a standing ovation for the brave children who had shared their story. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of the library, wondering if I had the strength to continue fighting for a relationship that my own grandchildren now seemed to view as a threat to their safety. But as I prepared to leave, feeling more defeated than I had ever felt in my life, something unexpected happened. A woman approached me hesitantly, her face showing recognition and concern. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but aren't you Mrs. Peterson? You taught my daughter Amanda 20 years ago at Lincoln Elementary." I looked up at this stranger, preparing myself for another encounter with someone who had heard the accusations and believed them. "Yes," I said quietly, "I'm Barbara Peterson." "Mrs. Peterson," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Amanda still talks about you. You changed her life. When she was struggling with reading, when other teachers wanted to hold her back, you stayed after school every day for months to help her. She's a successful attorney now, and she credits you with believing in her when no one else would." I stared at this woman, hardly daring to hope that someone still remembered the teacher I had been, rather than the monster I was now portrayed as. "I saw the news reports," she continued, "and I want you to know that I don't believe any of it, not for 1 second. The woman who saved my daughter's academic future would never hurt a child. Never." She pressed a business card into my hand. "My name is Jennifer Walsh, and my husband is a retired family court judge. We've been following your case, and we want to help. There are people who remember who you really are, Mrs. Peterson. You're not alone in this fight." For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope penetrate the darkness that had consumed my life. Someone remembered, someone believed, someone was willing to stand up for the truth. As I walked back to the shelter that night, Jennifer's business card clutched in my hand, I realized that my fight wasn't over. The woman who had once protected her daughter by accepting false blame was about to become the grandmother who would risk everything to reclaim the truth. The evidence was still there. The documentation was still waiting. And now, finally, I had allies who understood that this wasn't just about one family's dysfunction. It was about the fundamental question of whether truth could survive when confronted by sophisticated, calculated lies. 6 months after my descent into homelessness, I discovered that Melody and David had transformed my destruction into their opportunity for public acclaim. While I was struggling to survive in a homeless shelter, they were building careers as experts in child protection and family resilience. The Childhood Resilience and Protective Parenting Symposium was announced with great fanfare across social media and educational networks. Melody Peterson Williams, as she now called herself, was listed as the keynote speaker, described as a courageous mother who overcame generational trauma to protect her children from toxic family dynamics. I learned about the event from Sarah Martinez, a former teaching colleague who visited me at the shelter. Sarah had remained one of my few loyal friends, though even she admitted that the constant pressure from our professional community had made her question what she thought she knew about me. "Barbara," she said hesitantly, "I thought you should know about this conference. Melody is speaking about you, about breaking cycles of emotional abuse and protecting children from manipulative grandparents." The flyer Sarah showed me was a masterpiece of subtle character assassination. Melody's biographical description mentioned her personal experience overcoming childhood trauma inflicted by trusted authority figures, and her journey toward healthy boundaries and protective parenting. David was listed as a co-presenter, his credentials including first-hand experience supporting a spouse through family of origin abuse recovery, and expertise in recognizing and responding to elder manipulation tactics. The conference description promised to teach parents how to identify and protect their children from seemingly loving but ultimately harmful family relationships, and overcome guilt about establishing necessary boundaries with toxic relatives. I sat in that homeless shelter, reading about my life being turned into a cautionary tale, and felt a rage so pure and cold that it momentarily cleared away months of self-doubt and despair. The day of the conference, I managed to access the live stream from the public library. What I witnessed was a systematic dismantling of everything I had believed about love, family, and the work I had dedicated my life to. Melody took the stage wearing a professional blazer and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. She spoke about the insidious nature of emotional abuse disguised as love, and the courage required to protect your children from people who claim to care about them. My mother was a public school teacher, she said with carefully crafted sorrow, and everyone thought she was wonderful with children. But behind closed doors, she was controlling, manipulative, and emotionally destructive. She used her professional reputation to hide her true nature. The audience of parents, teachers, and child care professionals hung on every word. Here was someone who looked like them, who had credentials they respected, telling them about dangers they might not recognize in their own families. She documented everything my children did. Melody continued her voice, taking on the tone of someone sharing a dark secret. Every interaction, every minor injury, every moment of their lives. We thought it was love, but it was actually a form of surveillance and control. My meticulous journals, the careful records I had kept as a teacher and grandmother, were being portrayed as evidence of obsessive and inappropriate behavior. The love that had motivated me to preserve every precious moment with my grandchildren was being twisted into something sinister and threatening. David's presentation was even more devastating because it was delivered with the authority of someone who claimed to have witnessed my supposed crimes firsthand. Living with the aftermath of Barbara's influence on our family has been challenging, he said with practiced sympathy. She created an environment where children were constantly monitored, where natural childhood behaviors were scrutinized and documented. The psychological impact on my wife has been enormous. He spoke about the courage required to confront a family member's abusive behavior and the difficult but necessary process of protecting children from grandparents who use emotional manipulation to maintain control. Sometimes, the people who seem the most loving are actually the most dangerous, David explained, because they're so skilled at making their victims feel guilty for resisting them. But the most heartbreaking part of the conference was the video presentation featuring my grandchildren. Ethan, now 10, had clearly been coached to speak about his growth and healing since his grandmother had been removed from his life. I used to think I had to spend time with Grandma because she would get sad if I didn't, he said with the earnest expression of a child trying to please adults. But Mom taught me that it's okay to say no to people who make you feel bad, even if they say they love you. The audience murmured their approval, seeing a young boy who had been empowered to protect himself from manipulation. Chloe's contribution was a drawing exercise that had her creating two pictures side by side. The first, labeled before, showed a child figure surrounded by watching eyes and question marks. The second, labeled after, showed the same child playing freely under a bright sun. Grandma used to ask me lots and lots of questions, Chloe explained to the camera. She always wanted to know everything I did and everywhere I went. It made me feel scared and watched. Now I can just play and be happy. My careful attention to my grandchildren's lives, my genuine interest in their daily experiences, my desire to be involved in their world, all of it had been reframed as surveillance and emotional abuse. Watching this presentation from a computer in the public library, I felt my last reserves of emotional strength crumble. The children I had loved unconditionally were describing their relationship with me as if it had been a source of fear and oppression rather than joy and security. But as devastating as it was to see my grandchildren participate in this character assassination, what broke me completely was seeing how the audience responded. These were educators, parents, child care professionals, people who worked with children every day. And they were applauding the destruction of my reputation, nodding along with descriptions of my love as pathology. A panel discussion followed the presentations featuring several experts in child psychology and family dynamics. They analyzed Melody's story as a textbook case of covert emotional abuse and praised her courage in breaking the cycle of generational trauma. This case illustrates how difficult it can be to recognize emotional manipulation when it comes from someone with professional credentials, said Dr. Rebecca Hoffman, a child psychologist. Teachers in particular can be skilled at presenting themselves as nurturing while actually being controlling and inappropriate in their relationships with children. The woman was literally describing my profession as a risk factor for child abuse, suggesting that parents should be suspicious of teachers who showed too much interest in their students' lives. As the conference concluded with a standing ovation for Melody and David's bravery in sharing their story, I closed the laptop and sat in the empty library, feeling as though I had witnessed my own funeral. Everything I had been, everything I had worked for, everything I had believed about the value of loving attention and careful documentation. It had all been perverted into evidence of mental illness and criminal behavior. But as I prepared to leave feeling more defeated than I had thought possible, something unexpected happened. Margaret Wilson, my former principal and longtime friend, appeared in the library doorway. "Barbara," she said quietly, "I've been looking for you. I watched that conference, and I need you to know something. It's all lies, every word of it." Margaret sat down beside me, her face showing a mixture of anger and determination that I hadn't seen since our days fighting budget cuts and administrative incompetence. "I've been going through my files," she said, "and I found my notes from the day Ethan fell at school. I documented everything, the time of the accident, the nature of his injuries, the fact that you picked him up from the nurse's office. I have proof that the bruise they're using as evidence had nothing to do with you." For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. Margaret had always been meticulous about documentation, a habit that had served our school well during various crises over the years. "I've also been in touch with some other people," she continued. "Parents of children you taught, colleagues who worked with you, administrators who knew your character. We're putting together testimony that will show who you really are." She handed me a thick folder. "This is just the beginning, Barbara. We're going to fight this. We're going to expose what they've done to you, and we're going to restore your reputation." As I opened the folder and saw dozens of letters from parents whose children I had taught, testimonials from colleagues who had worked alongside me, documentation of awards and recognition I had received over 4 decades of service, I realized that my story wasn't over. The woman who had been destroyed by lies was about to be rebuilt by truth, and this time I wouldn't be fighting alone. 1 year after the false accusations began, David delivered what he clearly intended to be the final blow to my existence. The lawsuit papers were delivered to the homeless shelter by a process server who seemed embarrassed to be serving legal documents to a woman living in such circumstances. The lawsuit was massive, comprehensive, and designed to destroy any possibility of my ever recovering from this nightmare. David was suing me for $500,000 in damages, claiming that my persistent harassment and delusional accusations had caused severe emotional distress to his family and irreparable damage to Melody's reputation as a protective mother. Mrs. Peterson, my overwhelmed public defender, explained during our brief consultation they're alleging that your continued attempts to contact the children and your public statements about the family constitute a form of stalking and defamation. Every letter I had written trying to explain my side of the story, every phone call I had made attempting to reach my grandchildren, every desperate attempt to maintain some connection to my family, all of it was being used as evidence of my supposed mental instability and criminal behavior. But the lawsuit was just the beginning of David's final assault. Using his connections and Melody's growing reputation as a child protection advocate, he contacted the state teachers' retirement system with concerns about my mental competence and fitness to receive benefits. We've received reports that you may be suffering from cognitive decline and engaging in erratic behavior. The administrator explained during a phone call that felt like a death sentence. Your family has expressed concerns about your ability to manage your finances responsibly. The investigation that followed was swift and devastating. Based on the testimony of Melody and David, supported by Mr. Davies' carefully constructed legal record, the retirement system determined that I had engaged in conduct unbecoming a professional educator and posed a potential risk to public safety. My teaching pension, the modest income that had been my only source of financial security, was permanently revoked. 40 years of service, a spotless professional record, thousands of children whose lives I had touched. All of it counted for nothing when weighed against the testimony of my own daughter and son-in-law. The board feels that maintaining your benefits would send the wrong message about our commitment to child safety, the administrator explained with bureaucratic coldness. Effective immediately, all payments will cease and any professional honors will be withdrawn. Within weeks, I was completely destitute. The legal fees from defending against the criminal charges had already consumed my savings. The loss of my pension meant I could no longer afford even the modest accommodations I had found after leaving the homeless shelter. The eviction from my tiny studio apartment was scheduled for maximum public humiliation. Brenda had somehow learned about the court date and alerted local media, framing it as a story about the consequences of elder abuse and the importance of family protection. Elderly woman evicted after abusing grandchildren, read the headline in the local newspaper. The accompanying photo showed me carrying my few remaining possessions in garbage bags, looking exactly like the broken, dangerous woman they had portrayed me to be. Standing on the sidewalk with everything I owned stuffed into plastic bags, I felt the full weight of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just taken my family or my reputation. They had taken my very identity as a productive member of society. The return to Harbor Lights Emergency Shelter was even more humiliating the second time. The staff recognized me, and I could see the pity in their eyes as they processed my readmission paperwork. "Back again, Mrs. Peterson," asked Janet, the intake coordinator, with the practiced kindness of someone who had seen many people fall through society's cracks. "I'm sorry to see you here." But Melody and David's indifference to my suffering was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my destruction. As I struggled with homelessness and destitution, they continued to build their public profiles as child protection advocates. Melody's social media posts during this period showed a family thriving in their newfound freedom from my supposed toxicity. Photos of expensive family vacations, private school events for the children, professional conferences where she spoke about protective parenting, all funded by the increased child support and alimony that David's improved financial position had made possible. Grateful for the peace and security we found, she posted beneath a photo of the family at an upscale resort, Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the greatest blessings. David's public statements about my situation were even more chilling in their casual dismissal of my humanity. I have no legal or moral obligation to support someone who threatened my family's safety, he told a reporter who asked about my homelessness. Personal responsibility means accepting the consequences of your actions. The reporter's follow-up question about whether he felt any compassion for my circumstances received an answer that cut me to the bone. Compassion for predators enables their behavior. David replied with the confidence of someone who had successfully branded me as a criminal. The best thing we can do for people like Barbara is let them face the natural consequences of their choices. But Brenda's celebration of my destruction was the most vicious display of all. Using money that she claimed came from Melody's speaking fees and consulting work, she purchased a brand new family car and organized a public dedication ceremony. This vehicle represents our family's commitment to moving forward and leaving negativity behind, she announced at the event, which was covered by local news as a human interest story about resilience and healing. The car bore a custom license plate reading Safe Fam and was decorated with ribbons and flowers. Ethan and Chloe were photographed cutting a ceremonial ribbon, smiling and laughing as if they were celebrating a great victory. "This car will take us on new adventures," Chloe told the reporter with the innocent enthusiasm of a child who had been taught that my erasure from their lives was something to celebrate. The stress of watching my complete annihilation while struggling with homelessness and poverty finally broke my body as thoroughly as it had broken my spirit. The heart attack struck while I was walking to a food pantry, the chest pain so severe that I collapsed on the sidewalk. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the paramedic asked as I drifted in and out of consciousness in the ambulance. "You're having a cardiac event. We're taking you to the hospital." In the intensive care unit hovering between life and death, my mind began to retrieve memories I had buried for decades. The fragments came back like pieces of a puzzle, gradually forming a complete picture that was both terrifying and illuminating. I remembered a family I had worked with during my early teaching career where a manipulative mother had successfully convinced authorities that her daughter's teacher was emotionally abusing the child. The mother had used the same tactics I was now experiencing: false documentation, coach testimonies, systematic character assassination. In my semi-conscious state, I began to understand that what was happening to me wasn't unique or personal. It was a pattern, a methodology, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare that Melody had somehow learned to deploy with devastating effectiveness. The realization that I was the victim of a calculated campaign rather than a family dispute gave me something I hadn't felt in over a year: clarity about the true nature of my situation and the beginnings of a plan to fight back. As the machines monitored my failing heart, I made a promise to myself and to the memory of the teacher I had once been. If I survived this, I would not go quietly into the darkness they had prepared for me. The evidence was still there. The truth was still waiting. And somewhere in the depths of my professional experience was the knowledge I needed to expose what they had done to me. I survived the heart attack, though the doctors said it was touch and go for several days. When I finally opened my eyes in the cardiac intensive care unit, the first face I saw was Jennifer Walsh, the mother of my former student, who had become my strongest advocate. "Mrs. Peterson," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We thought we were going to lose you. My husband has been working around the clock with Margaret Wilson and your other supporters. We're going to fight this. We're going to get justice." As I slowly recovered the memories that had surfaced during my near-death experience, crystallized into a clear understanding of what I was facing. This wasn't just family dysfunction or personal betrayal. It was a sophisticated campaign of psychological manipulation that followed patterns I had witnessed in my professional career. From my hospital bed with Jennifer's help, I recorded what I intended to be my final plea to Melody. My voice was weak, my appearance gaunt from months of stress and poverty, but my mind was clearer than it had been in over a year. Melody, I said, looking directly into the camera Jennifer held, I know you're going to see this message, and I need you to remember who you really are. I have recordings of our conversations where you admitted the accusations were false. I have evidence that you deliberately fabricated the abuse claims to secure custody and financial benefits. I paused, gathering strength for the most difficult part of my message. But more than that, I need you to remember what happened when you were 8 years old. The fire in the garage, the neighbor's dog, the way I protected you from blame and consequences because I thought I was being a good mother. My voice broke as I spoke about the pattern I now recognized. I taught you that people who love you will absorb blame and consequences to protect you from discomfort. I taught you that truth was negotiable when it served your emotional needs. I thought I was protecting you, but I was actually enabling you to become someone who could destroy the people who love you most. The video was raw, emotional, devastating in its honesty. I laid out the timeline of Melody's false accusations, played audio recordings of her admitting she knew the charges were fabricated, and detailed the systematic campaign of character assassination that had destroyed my life. This has to stop, I concluded, not just for me, but for Ethan and Chloe. They're learning that lying and manipulation are acceptable tools when you want something. You're teaching them to become the kind of people who destroy families for money and convenience. Jennifer assured me she would personally deliver the video to Melody, hoping that seeing her mother's deteriorated condition and hearing the truth spoken so plainly might awaken some vestige of conscience. But Brenda had been monitoring my situation through contacts at the hospital, and she intercepted the message before Melody ever saw it. What happened next was so calculated, so vicious, that it redefined my understanding of human cruelty. Brenda took my desperate plea to my daughter and turned it into a weapon against me. Using professional video editing software, she manipulated my recording with stunning sophistication. She spliced sentences together, altered the tone of my voice, added ominous background music, and removed all context that might generate sympathy. The heavily doctored video, titled Elderly Abuser's Delusional Hospital Rant, was sold to Entertainment Tonight for what I later learned was a substantial sum. Brenda marketed it as exclusive footage of a mentally ill woman's breakdown, complete with expert commentary from paid psychologists who had never met me. The national news segment aired on a Thursday evening, reaching millions of viewers. The anchor introduced it with practiced concern. Tonight, a disturbing look at how mental illness can transform a grandmother into a source of terror for her own family. This exclusive footage shows the deteriorating state of 73-year-old Barbara Peterson, whose paranoid accusations have torn apart a loving family. They played my manipulated words over images of Melody and David looking devastated, their faces, masks of fake concern and manufactured grief. My desperate plea for my daughter to remember the truth was twisted into evidence of my complete disconnection from reality. The psychological experts analyzed my facial expressions, my tone of voice, my choice of words, concluding that I was clearly suffering from severe paranoid delusions with possible dementia. They praised my family's patience and strength in dealing with such a challenging, and potentially dangerous situation. What we're seeing here is a textbook case of elder mental illness manifesting as persecution fantasies, explained Dr. Martin Stevens, a psychiatrist who had never examined me. The patient has created an elaborate narrative where she's the victim, when in fact she's the source of trauma for everyone around her. But the cruelest part was Melody's response. She appeared on the show via satellite link, her performance a masterpiece of manufactured anguish. "This is incredibly painful for our entire family," she said, her voice breaking with practiced emotion. "To see my mother, who was once such a loving woman, reduced to these conspiracy theories and accusations. It's heartbreaking. We've tried everything to help her, but she refuses treatment and continues to blame everyone else for her problems." The interviewer asked about my claims regarding the false abuse allegations and the evidence I claimed to possess. Melody's response was flawless in its manipulation. "My mother has always had difficulty accepting responsibility for her actions," she said with carefully crafted sadness. In her confused state, she's reinterpreted normal family boundaries as some kind of conspiracy against her. We've had to limit contact for the safety of our children. She brought Ethan on camera, my 11-year-old grandson, who looked genuinely distressed by the situation. The boy had been thoroughly coached, but his emotions appeared authentic. "I just want Grandma to get better," Ethan said, his young voice heavy with manufactured concern. "She used to be so nice, but now she just says scary things about Mom and Dad. I wish she could be normal again, so we could see her." The performance was devastating. Melody came across as a devoted daughter, struggling with her mother's tragic decline, while I appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a delusional old woman whose paranoid fantasies were traumatizing innocent children. David appeared briefly in the segment, offering subtle support for his wife's narrative. "Melody has shown incredible strength in dealing with this situation," he said with feigned admiration. "It's not easy when someone you love becomes a source of fear rather than comfort." The segment ended with an expert panel discussing the warning signs of elder mental illness and the importance of protecting children from unstable family members. My destruction was being used as an educational opportunity to help other families recognize and respond to similar situations. But what Melody and Brenda didn't know was that Margaret Wilson had been watching the broadcast with growing horror and outrage. As my former principal and lifelong friend, she recognized immediately that something was fundamentally wrong with their narrative. The day after the broadcast aired, Margaret contacted the news station directly. "I worked with Barbara Peterson for 15 years, she told the producer. "The woman you portrayed on your show bears no resemblance to the person I know. Someone is lying here, and it's not Barbara." Margaret had brought documentation with her, my personnel files, letters from Grateful Parents Awards for teaching excellence, and most importantly, her own detailed notes about Ethan's playground accident that had resulted in the bruise being used as evidence against me. "I was there when Barbara picked Ethan up from the school nurse," Margaret explained to anyone who would listen. "I documented the incident myself. The bruise they're using as proof of abuse came from a fall at school, and Barbara Peterson had nothing to do with it. But perhaps most damaging to their narrative was Margaret's analysis of the edited video itself. As someone with experience in media production from her work in educational technology, she quickly identified signs of digital manipulation. The timestamps have been altered, sentences have been spliced together, and Mrs. Peterson's voice has been subtly modified to sound more confused and agitated. She explained to a private investigator she had hired with funds from a growing coalition of my supporters. Jennifer Walsh had also been busy reaching out to other former colleagues, parents of children I had taught, and retired education professionals who remembered my work. A powerful network of advocates was forming, people who understood that what was happening to me represented a threat to anyone who had devoted their life to caring for others. As I lay in my hospital bed, unaware of the national humiliation being broadcast about me, these unlikely allies were building a case that would eventually expose the sophisticated fraud that had destroyed my life. The truth was finally mobilizing, and it was more powerful than any lie Melody and her conspirators had constructed. Sometimes justice takes longer than we hope, but when it arrives, it has the power to illuminate even the darkest deception. My story wasn't ending with defeat and humiliation. It was approaching the moment when all the evidence I had carefully preserved, all the allies who had never stopped believing in me, and all the truth that had been buried under months of lies would finally surface. The teacher in me had always believed that knowledge was power. I was about to discover just how right I had been. 6 months after my hospitalization, I sat in the office of Jennifer Walsh's husband, retired Judge Robert Walsh, surrounded by the most formidable legal team I could have imagined. The funding had come from an unexpected source, a separate emergency account I had established decades earlier as a teacher money I had forgotten about during the chaos of my destruction, but which Jennifer had helped me locate. "Barbara," Judge Walsh said, with the gravity that comes from 40 years on the bench, "we're going to file the most comprehensive elder abuse case this state has ever seen. The evidence you preserved, combined with what Margaret and our investigative team have uncovered, is overwhelming." The federal civil and criminal lawsuit we launched sent shockwaves through the legal community and the media. We charged Melody and David with criminal elder abuse fraud, parental alienation, and defamation. The case attracted national attention, with legal experts calling it a landmark prosecution that could change how courts handle elder abuse cases. Peterson versus Peterson-Williams became the most watched courtroom drama of the year, with cameras broadcasting live to millions of viewers around the world. The same media that had once destroyed my reputation was now captivated by my fight for justice. The courtroom was packed on the day we presented our evidence. Melody and David sat at the defendant's table, their confidence from months earlier replaced by visible anxiety. Their expensive lawyers shuffled through papers with the desperate energy of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle. "Your Honor," announced my lead attorney, Sarah Chen, "we would like to present Exhibit A, surveillance footage from Mrs. Peterson's doorbell camera taken on the day of the alleged abuse incident." The large screen in the courtroom flickered to life, and suddenly the truth I had been trying to tell for over 2 years was visible for the world to see. The timestamp showed the date of Ethan's playground accident, and there was Melody leaving my house in obvious agitation. The footage was crystal clear. Melody rushed to her car, immediately pulled out her phone, and began what appeared to be an urgent conversation. Even without audio, her body language screamed calculation and manipulation rather than the distress of a mother who had just discovered abuse. "Notice the timing," Sarah explained to the jury. "Mrs. Peterson's daughter leaves the house at 2:47 p.m. immediately after learning about her son's playground injury. The abuse allegations were filed with police at 3:15 p.m., less than 30 minutes later. But the most damning footage came next. The camera had captured Melody returning to my house 3 hours later with Mr. Davies and another man I didn't recognize. The audio was faint but audible as they approached my front door. "Are you sure about the story?" the unknown man could be heard asking. "It's perfect," Melody replied with chilling confidence. "The bruise exists, The timing works, and Barbara can't prove a negative. Once she's out of the picture, David's custody position becomes much stronger, and my financial situation stabilizes. The gasps from the courtroom gallery were audible. Here was my daughter discussing my destruction like a business transaction, admitting that the abuse allegations were fabricated for financial gain. The recording continued capturing Melody's casual discussion of her financial motivations. The child support and alimony total over $5,000 a month, but only if I maintain primary custody. Barbara's been David's biggest supporter in court, always advocating for his parental rights. Remove her influence, and I control the narrative completely. Sarah then presented the original uncropped photograph of Ethan's bruise, clearly showing him in his school uniform, surrounded by playground equipment, with the school nurse's timestamp indicating when the injury occurred. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sarah announced this photograph was taken at Lincoln Elementary School at 1:23 p.m. on the day in question. Mrs. Peterson didn't pick up her grandson until 2:30 p.m., over an hour after this injury occurred. The defense's entire case is built on a lie. When Melody was called to testify, I watched my daughter approach the witness stand with a mixture of sorrow and anticipation. For months, she had been the confident architect of my destruction. Now faced with irrefutable evidence of her lies, she looked like what she had always been underneath the manipulation, a frightened woman who had made terrible choices. Ms. Peterson Williams. Sarah began, "Do you recognize the person in this surveillance footage discussing fabricated abuse allegations?" Melody stared at the screen, watching herself admit to fraud in her own words. The color drained from her face as she realized that every lie she had told, every false accusation she had made was now exposed for the world to see. That's taken out of context," she began, but her voice lacked conviction. "Ms. Peterson Williams, you stated on this recording that the abuse allegations were fabricated to secure custody and financial benefits. Are you now claiming this statement was taken out of context?" The weight of her exposure seemed to crush Melody physically. She began to hyperventilate, her carefully constructed composure crumbling completely. The woman who had appeared on national television as a protective mother was revealed as a sophisticated fraud, and the recognition of her public humiliation overwhelmed her completely. I can't. This isn't," she stammered, then broke down into incoherent sobbing. Judge Martinez called for a recess as Melody collapsed at the witness stand, but the damage was complete. The jury had seen the truth the media had recorded her breakdown, and the world now understood what had really happened to me. David's attempt to flee the courtroom was captured by dozens of cameras. The man who had once smugly discussed his lack of obligation to support me was now running from the consequences of his conspiracy. Court security apprehended him before he reached the exit, his own breakdown following immediately after. I was just following Melody's lead. He sobbed as they led him back to his seat. I didn't know how far she would take it. I never meant for it to go this far. Mr. Davies, their lawyer, sat at the defense table with his head in his hands. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Recordings of him coaching Melody and David on their testimony bills for fabricated expert witnesses, documentation of his role in manipulating the legal system. His career was over, his reputation, destroyed, criminal charges pending. But perhaps the most important moment came when Judge Martinez addressed the court. "In 30 years on this bench," he said with controlled anger, "I have rarely seen such calculated, sophisticated elder abuse. The defendants didn't just steal money. They stole dignity, identity, and family relationships from a woman who had devoted her life to caring for others. As I sat in that courtroom, watching the truth finally triumph over the lies that had destroyed my life, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, relief that the nightmare was finally ending, but there was also profound sadness for what we had all lost in this terrible journey. The woman who had once protected her daughter by accepting false blame had become the grandmother who had fought for truth at any cost. Justice was being served, but it came with a price that none of us could have anticipated. The evidence had spoken, the truth had prevailed, and for the first time in over 2 years, I could see a future that belonged to me rather than to the lies that had been told about me. Judge Martinez's verdict was swift and comprehensive, delivered with the authority of someone who had been deeply moved by the evidence presented. The courtroom was silent as he spoke his words, carrying the weight of absolute justice. The court finds Melody Peterson Williams and David Williams guilty of criminal elder abuse fraud, parental alienation, and conspiracy to commit fraud, he announced. The systematic campaign of lies and manipulation perpetrated against Barbara Peterson represents one of the most sophisticated and cruel cases of family exploitation this court has ever encountered. Melody was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. David received 7 years with eligibility for parole after 5. The judge also ordered full restitution of all financial damages plus punitive damages totaling $1.2 million. This court finds that Barbara Peterson is and has always been mentally competent, professionally ethical, and personally loving, Judge Martinez declared. The evidence clearly shows that she was the victim of a calculated fraud designed to steal her assets, destroy her reputation, and eliminate her influence in her grandchildren's lives. Those words meant more to me than any monetary award. For over 2 years, I had been told I was crazy, abusive, dangerous. To hear a federal judge state unequivocally that I was the victim, not the perpetrator, was a restoration of my very identity. The judge continued with a statement that would be quoted in elder law textbooks for years to come. Elder abuse is not just about financial exploitation or physical neglect. It includes the systematic destruction of an elderly person's dignity, relationships, and sense of self. When families weaponize the legal system against their elders, they attack the very foundation of what makes us human. The courtroom erupted in applause, but I felt strangely quiet inside. Justice had been served, but at what cost my daughter was going to prison. My son-in-law, despite his complicity, was facing years of incarceration. My grandchildren would grow up with their parents behind bars. Mr. Davies was immediately disbarred and faced additional criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. His law license was permanently revoked, his practice dissolved, his reputation destroyed by his participation in my family's fraud. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received my first letter from Melody in prison. It was pages long, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose world had completely collapsed. "Mom," it began, "I know you probably never want to hear from me again, but I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. The therapy here is helping me see how sick I became, how the desperation for money and control twisted my thinking until I could justify destroying the person who loved me most." The letter went on to detail her participation in various rehabilitation programs, her work with a prison psychologist, and her slowly growing understanding of the magnitude of her betrayal. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I just want you to know that the woman who hurt you wasn't really me. It was what I became when greed and desperation took over. I'm trying to find my way back to the person you raised, but I know it may be too late. Reading her letter, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at what she had done, sadness for what she had become, and a tiny flicker of hope that perhaps someday some version of reconciliation might be possible. David's letter came a month later, and it was perhaps more painful to read because it was so clearly genuine. Unlike Melody's sometimes self-serving explanations, David took full responsibility for his actions. "Barbara," he wrote, "I was a coward. I knew Melody's accusations were false, but I went along with them because it served my financial interests and my desire to maintain peace in my marriage. I helped destroy an innocent woman to avoid confronting my wife's manipulation." He detailed his participation in intensive therapy, his growing understanding of how financial pressure had corrupted his moral judgment, and his commitment to spending the rest of his life making amends for the damage he had caused. "You were the best grandmother my children could have asked for," he continued, "and I helped take that away from them for money and convenience. There is no punishment severe enough for what I've done, but I want you to know that I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to become worthy of your eventual forgiveness." Brenda, who had been Melody's most enthusiastic enabler, faced her own consequences. Though she wasn't criminally charged, the public exposure of her role in my destruction led to complete social ostracism. Her employer terminated her, her social circles abandoned her, and she found herself as isolated as she had tried to make me. But the most important part of my healing came through my relationship with Ethan and Chloe. 6 months after the trial, they came to see me for the first time in over 2 years. Ethan, now 12, was taller and more serious than I remembered. When he saw me, he broke down in tears that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "Grandma," he sobbed, "I said such terrible things to you. I told you to die. How could I have said that to you?" Looking at this young man, barely an adolescent, struggling with the weight of his family's destruction, I felt only compassion. He had been manipulated just as I had been turned into a weapon against me by adults he trusted. "You were lied to," I told him, simply holding him as he cried. "You believed what the adults in your life told you to believe. That's not your fault, sweetheart. That's never your fault." Chloe, now 10, was quieter, but equally troubled. She had brought a new drawing with her, this one, showing a family that included a grandmother figure holding hands with 2 children under a rainbow. "I want to fix my old picture," she said shyly, "the one where I left you out. It wasn't a real family picture because you weren't in it." The process of rebuilding our relationship was slow and careful, guided by family therapists who specialized in helping children recover from parental alienation. But gradually, the bonds we had shared began to resurface, stronger now, because they were built on truth rather than manipulation. Ethan began asking questions about his family's history, wanting to understand how the adults he had trusted could have lied to him so completely. Chloe started visiting me regularly, bringing her homework and asking for help with reading, just as she had done before this nightmare began. "I missed you so much, Grandma," she told me one afternoon as we worked on a book report together. "Even when I thought you were bad, I still missed you. I didn't understand why." My vindication was complete. My integrity had been restored, my assets recovered, my reputation rebuilt. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was the gradual healing of relationships that mattered more to me than any legal judgment. The woman who had been dragged from her home as a supposed child abuser had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights. But more importantly, she had become a grandmother, again beloved and trusted by children who now understood the difference between truth and lies. Justice had been served, but it had come at an enormous cost. Families were broken, lives were destroyed, and innocence was lost. The truth had triumphed, but the price of that victory would be felt for generations. Still sitting in my restored home with my grandchildren reading together and planning our future, I knew that every moment of the struggle had been worth it. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for the right to love and be loved honestly. 3 years after the trial that changed everything, I stood in my restored home watching Ethan help Chloe with her science project at my kitchen table. The scene was so beautifully ordinary, so peacefully normal that it took my breath away. This was what family was supposed to look like. People who cared for each other, supported each other, and most importantly, told each other the truth. My house had been returned to me exactly as I had left it, but somehow it felt transformed, more precious than before. Every room held memories, not just of what I had lost, but of what I had fought to reclaim. The living room, where Melody had staged her cruel accusations, was now filled with the laughter of grandchildren who knew the truth and chose to love me because of it, not despite it. The garden I had tended for decades bloomed more beautifully than ever. I had learned to see it not just as a collection of plants, but as a metaphor for resilience. Even after the harshest winter, even when it seems like nothing will ever grow again, life finds a way to return stronger and more beautiful than before. My relationship with Ethan and Chloe had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than what we had shared before this nightmare began. They were older now, wiser in ways that children shouldn't have to be, but also more appreciative of honesty and genuine love. "Grandma," Ethan said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I understand now why you fought so hard for the truth. It would have been easier to just give up, but then Chloe and I would never have known who you really are." At 14, he had developed a maturity that both impressed and saddened me. This young man understood concepts of justice and integrity that some adults never grasp, but he had learned them through pain that no child should have to endure. Chloe, now 12, had blossomed into a confident, curious girl who asked thoughtful questions about everything from family dynamics to social justice. Her teacher had recommended her for the gifted program, and she often talked about wanting to become a lawyer to help people like Grandma who get hurt by lies. My relationship with Melody remained complex, but was slowly evolving. Her letters from prison had become more thoughtful, more genuinely remorseful, more focused on understanding rather than self-pity. "I think about the woman you were before I destroyed everything," she wrote in her most recent letter. "Strong, respected, beloved by your grandchildren. I took that away from you and I can never give it back. But maybe if I become a better person, if I really change, that could be a small way of honoring who you were and who you still are." I had visited her once 8 months after her sentencing. Seeing her in prison uniform, seeing the weight she had lost, and the haunted look in her eyes, I felt more sadness than anger. This was my daughter, the little girl I had raised destroyed by choices she had made as an adult. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely," I told her honestly. "But I can see that you're trying to change, and that matters to me." It wasn't reconciliation exactly. It was something more nuanced, an acknowledgement that love and accountability could coexist, that family bonds could survive even the worst betrayal if there was genuine commitment to truth and change. David's journey had been different, but equally significant. His letters showed a man genuinely committed to understanding how he had become someone capable of destroying an innocent person for financial convenience. I grew up believing that loyalty to my spouse meant supporting her no matter what, he wrote. I confused love with enabling, and I helped create a situation where terrible things seemed justified. I'm learning the difference between supporting someone and participating in their worst impulses. David had been released after serving 4 years of his sentence, and he now worked at a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing elder abuse. His first-hand experience as a perpetrator gave him unique insights into the mindset that allows people to rationalize hurting vulnerable family members. The foundation I had established with the restitution money had become my greatest source of purpose and joy. The Barbara Peterson Foundation for Elder Justice provided legal aid for elderly victims of family fraud, funded research into parental alienation, and supported programs that help children recover from manipulation. My memoir, Fighting Back, A Grandmother's Battle for Truth, had become a bestseller, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. Thousands of elderly people wrote to thank me for giving them hope, for showing them that they could fight back against abuse, for proving that their dignity and their truth mattered. But perhaps most meaningful were the speaking engagements that had become a regular part of my life. Standing in front of audiences of social workers, lawyers, family court judges, and concerned family members, sharing my story and educating people about the sophisticated nature of modern elder abuse, I found a purpose I had never expected. The most important thing to remember, I would tell these audiences, is that elderly people are not burdens to be managed or problems to be solved. We are human beings with rights, dignity, and often a lifetime of wisdom to share. When we fight for elder rights, we're fighting for the kind of society we want to be. My days now were filled with activities. I chose people I loved and work that mattered. I volunteered at Lincoln Elementary, my old school, mentoring new teachers and sharing what I had learned about recognizing the signs of family dysfunction in children. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who had been branded as dangerous to children was now considered an expert in child protection, but it felt like a restoration of natural order rather than vindication of my innocence. I read voraciously, traveled when I wanted to manage my own finances with the same skill that had once made me a respected educator. The woman who had once been declared incompetent was now consulted by legal experts and quoted in academic journals about elder abuse and family manipulation. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my new life was the quiet moments. Sitting in my garden with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the same landscape I had tended for decades. Having dinner with Ethan and Chloe, sharing stories and making new memories. Reading Melody's letters and seeing genuine progress in her journey toward understanding and redemption. I had learned that strength isn't just about fighting back against cruelty, though that was important. Real strength is about rebuilding after the fight is over, about choosing hope over bitterness, about transforming pain into purpose. The woman who had been dragged from her home in garbage bags had become a nationally recognized advocate, a best-selling author, and a symbol of hope for elderly people everywhere. But more importantly, she had become someone who understood that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about thriving in spite of everything that tries to break you. My victory was complete, not because I had defeated my enemies, but because I had reclaimed myself. The truth had set me free, but even more than that, I had set myself free by refusing to let lies define my future. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibility and purpose. Ethan would graduate high school soon and had already been accepted to several colleges. Chloe was developing into a thoughtful, compassionate young woman who understood the importance of standing up for truth. Melody would eventually be released from prison, and we would continue the slow, difficult process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than manipulation. For the first time in years, I looked forward to the future with genuine joy. Life, I had learned, was not about avoiding betrayal or hardship. It was about what you chose to do after the worst had already happened. And I had chosen to fight to heal, to forgive where possible, and to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. As I write these final words, 5 years have passed since that terrible day when my daughter's false accusations turned my world upside down, transforming me from a beloved grandmother into a suspected child abuser. Today, I sit in the same kitchen where I once felt so powerless, but everything has changed. My days now overflow with purpose and genuine happiness. Ethan calls every Sunday from college, where he's studying social work with a focus on family advocacy inspired by our family's journey through lies to truth. Chloe stops by after school twice a week, still bringing her homework, but now also sharing her dreams of becoming a family court judge who will protect vulnerable people from manipulation. The foundation I established has helped over 400 elderly victims of family fraud recover their dignity and assets. My book continues to give hope to families facing similar struggles, and the speaking engagements allow me to travel the country, sharing a message that resonates in community centers, legal conferences, and family workshops. Everywhere, elderly people are not disposable, and it's never too late to fight for truth. Melody writes every month from prison, her letters showing gradual but genuine growth toward understanding and accountability. She's becoming the person I always hoped she could be, though it took losing everything for her to find her way back to her humanity. Our relationship may never fully heal, but it has transformed into something honest, which is perhaps more valuable than what we lost. The greatest lesson from my journey is this: our worth as human beings isn't determined by our age, our vulnerability, or our dependence on others for care. It's determined by our courage to stand up for truth, our refusal to accept abuse as inevitable, and our commitment to fighting for dignity. Not just our own, but for every person who has been told they don't matter anymore. To anyone listening to my story who sees their own struggle reflected in it, please know this: you are not powerless. You are not crazy. You are not a burden. Your voice matters, your dignity matters, and your fight for justice matters. Truth has a way of surfacing even when it seems buried beneath mountains of lies and manipulation. The woman I am today, peaceful, purposeful, surrounded by genuine love and engaged in meaningful work, was forged in the fires of the worst betrayal imaginable. But fire doesn't just destroy, it also purifies. It burns away everything false and leaves behind only what is real, what is strong, what is true. I am Barbara Peterson. I am a survivor, an advocate, a grandmother, a teacher. I am living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your life, never too late to fight for truth, and never too late to transform your deepest pain into your greatest purpose. And that perhaps is the most beautiful victory of all.